Hello, thank you for joining us on Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. The Department of Defense says a special measures agreement will be up for talks in the U.S.-South Korea defense ministers meeting. The upcoming U.S.-South Korea military drills is also expected to be addressed. We take a look at the pending issues between the two allies.
Got to work through the agreement for funding the forces, so that will obviously be a topic we will.
In the studio with me is Richard Johnson, Senior Director for Fuel Cycle and Verification at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Mr. Johnson served as Director for Nonproliferation at the National Security Council in the Obama administration. Also joining me is Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of Seoul's foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Johnson, I want to start off with you.
Sure.
So, one of the most pressing issues right now between the allies is the current SMA negotiations. So, this negotiation is led by the State Department. And what can the U.S. and South Korea defense chiefs discuss on this issue?
Well, as somebody who used to work a little bit on this issue at the State Department, I can tell you that, at least under normal operations, this will be an interagency sort of coordination. So while the State Department's negotiator is in the lead, the delegation is full, of course, of individuals from the Department of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and others. So my expectation is that when Defense Minister Jung and Secretary Esper meet, they'll be talking about really top-level issues. Unless there's something very close to getting done in the negotiations, some very specific issue, I doubt they're going to be looking at specific numbers or budgetary items. This is going to be about trying to keep these talks on the pathway forward. And if there's something that's about to fall apart, that's when these top-level negotiations will come in. But my expectation will be that the ultimate deal is going to be hashed out at these working-level negotiations and then blessed at some point, probably at the very top.
Mm-hmm. So Mr. Johnson just mentioned that they're not likely to talk about specific numbers of the agreement. Then how do you think this meeting can serve to contribute to the agreement between the two sides?
Well, it can move the ball forward, but it's simply not going to be the move that makes it cross the finish line. And so what you're really talking about is you've got senior level guidance, but you also have staff that are able to come together on the occasion of a senior level meeting who can talk with each other and hopefully develop some kinds of understandings that can move the situation forward. But as Richard said, I mean, ultimately for this sort of agreement, it's really going to require a leader-to-leader level conversation. That's when we are going to know that we're on the cusp of actually resolving the issue.
Mm-hmm. So we clearly have to move the negotiations forward, but we're hearing from senior U.S. officials, and CNN is reporting that the U.S. has adjusted its posture over the course of 6 rounds of negotiations, but South Korea has moved significantly less. So what does the current situation look like right now?
Well, I think it's right that the U.S. adjusted its posture in mid-January at the last round of kind of working level negotiations. It's clear that there is pressure on South Korea to reciprocate that gesture. And then the real question is, I think it's basically a structural question, because the U.S. came in with such a large ask at the beginning. Now it's asking South Korea to reciprocate, but it's not yet clear that the U.S. is really in the ballpark in terms of what is reasonable, and in particular, what can be ratified by the South Korean National Assembly.
Mm-hmm. So we're also seeing the timing is a very interesting topic here. We're seeing the April elections in South Korea, and U.S. officials are saying that As we get closer to this general elections in South Korea, it's going to be harder to reach a deal. So are you concerned that we might miss this April deadline when South Korean employees start getting furloughed?
I am concerned about that. And in fact, if you look at the negotiating strategy that the Trump administration used within our own budgetary system, the Trump administration often likes to go past deadlines. If you look at our own budget, we had government shutdowns where they used that threat and that leverage to try to get better deals. So it's very possible that the fact that South Korean workers may be furloughed, or at the bare minimum, that the South Korean government will have to take on the task of paying those workers, it might be additional leverage that the administration might want to use. Now, ultimately, I think probably we're going to have to see these talks extended because we know even in a normal situation, the issue of the SMA, the burden sharing agreement, is a very controversial one in South Korean politics. Not so much so in U.S. politics, but I can't imagine that getting a quick deal right before an election is going to be something that the Moon Jae-in government would like to see happen.
How do you think the South Korean government is going to be dealing with this issue in terms of timing?
So the critical issue that Richard just raised is the issue of the furloughs. And I think that that is a huge pressure point. Unlike in the U.S. Government, where shutdowns occur and then U.S. government officials can receive back pay, that is not the case for South Korean workers who are working for U.S. Forces Korea. And so I think that the right counter for the South Korean government in that instance is to try to find some way to secure a budget that can be used to pay the South Korean workers as a way of helping to buy time in order to make an agreement. And I agree that this is actually not the most propitious moment to come to agreement. It's actually quite awkward to come to an agreement in the period of a prior National Assembly before an election and then have it voted on by the next National Assembly. It actually serves to politicize some of the key issues in the relationship. And I think our objective actually should be to depoliticize and to protect the alliance from domestic politicization.
I also want to take a look at this from the alliance perspective. Are you concerned that the U.S. request of a significant increase in South Korea's defense costs will create some kind of mistrust among South Korea and hurt the alliance in the long term?
This is one of my greatest concerns about this entire situation. Again, it's not unusual for the U.S. and the ROK to have disagreements about burden sharing. This was the case when I first started working on this back in the George W. Bush administration. But we were talking about, increases on a 10%, 20% level, not 400%. Our alliance should not be judged in dollars or in won. It should be judged on our history of shared sacrifice, our shared values, the importance of extended deterrence, and the importance of regional and international security. That's not something you can put a cost to. And so if we continue to look at this as a business negotiation, I worry that the South Korean people and its leaders will start to be less and less enamored with the U.S.-ROK alliance, which has been so important not only for protecting South Korea, but also, as somebody who's a nuclear expert, in preventing proliferation in the Northeast Asian region. At this point, our extended deterrence is giving the South Koreans the option not to have to pursue a nuclear program. If people start to question that extended deterrence, there are lots of questions about proliferation in the region that will start to emerge.
And also from the U.S. side as well, we're reportedly hearing that the U.S. military officials are expressing concern that it could undermine the U.S. military mission in South Korea amid North Korean tensions. So what do you make of that?
Well, readiness is extremely important. They always say in USAFK, you need to be ready to fight tonight. And if the inability to train, the inability to coordinate with the South Korean government within USAFK is endangered by this budgetary issue, that's not good for the South Korean government. That's certainly not good for the United States. And only the North Koreans will benefit from this, and perhaps the Chinese. And so, we have to kind of keep our eye on the ball, as they would say, that we have to continue to uphold this alliance. Now, there's lots of different ways you can structure these things. There's lots of different ways that you can hold exercises. But if we're simply letting the alliance languish, that's a very negative outcome.
What kind of an impact do you think this will have on the alliance in the long term?
Well, I think it's the wrong way to go, primarily because, as Richard was saying, we really think about the U.S.-Korea relationship in friendship terms. And as a South Korean National Assemblyman put it to me, the last thing you want to do in the context of a friendship is to haggle over money. It actually serves to create distance in the friendship, and that is going to be less effective for us going forward as an approach to our common challenges.
And I also want to look at the construction of a U.S. base in South Korea of a THAAD system, the Seongju base. So there is a little disagreement between the two sides. South Korea is saying that this is not part of the SMA negotiations, while the budget proposal from the Department of Army is saying that the possibility of the host nation funding has been addressed. So how should we make of this situation?
Well, the possibility of host nation funding does not necessarily mean that this issue has to be included as part of the SMA negotiations. Instead, I see the issue of the THAAD base as a remnant of the 2017 discussion of trying to get the missiles in place. It is an incomplete piece of that particular agreement that has yet to be addressed. And frankly, there's been a lot of hardship over the course of the past 3 years for USFK logistically to be able to support these THAAD batteries without any infrastructure in place, to include having to fly in by helicopter supplies for troops that are manning these batteries because of opposition at the local level. And so this is a complicated issue. There hasn't been an environmental assessment done, but it is also an issue that does need to move forward. I'm glad to see that the budgetary arrangements are coming into place to be able to address the issue.
How should we read into this situation right now?
Well, I think that on the issue of THAAD, the most pressing issue here is that the reason we're talking about THAAD at all is because of the North Korean missile program. The North Koreans are developing missiles that are going to be easier to fuel, quicker to launch, more mobile, and the real point of all of this is to try to avoid U.S. and ROK missile defenses.
And actually, the Department of Defense actually revealed plans of separating the THAAD launchers and the THAAD batteries and moving the THAAD launchers forward on the Korean Peninsula. So do you see the necessity for this?
I think that I do. And again, it comes back to the fact that when we're seeing solid fuel missiles, short range missiles being developed by North Korea that may be more maneuverable, that are intended to try to get around existing missile defense systems, you have to start to broaden the scope of what territory you can defend in South Korea. So that may require either deploying additional batteries or separating the launchers and the batteries. Of course, that will lead to lots of questions about where in South Korea are these positioned, and in the past, we had debates about this domestically.
I also want to take a look at the U.S.-South Korea military drills. Secretary Esper said that the U.S. can consider resuming the drills depending on North Korean behavior. So do you think that the drills should resume this time again?
No, I think we should wait a little bit longer. I think we should go through this cycle and have a discussion in the summer and fall about a decision that would be made at this year's SCM, but leave the current regime in place. And one of the main reasons for that is that the main focus, I think, of the revised drill schedule is related to the OPCON transition issue. And so I think that it's important to go ahead and not disrupt the plans to do the kinds of drills that would test the abilities of the new OPCON transition arrangements before trying to make any additional revisions in response to what is happening in North Korea. And then the other critical thing is what's happening with the North Korean winter training cycle. Last year they didn't change it. I think we need to evaluate what they're doing and to try to see whether they're actually responding. And I think that the likelihood that they're going to be responding positively is low, but we should still wait and see.
Do you agree that we should wait and see?
So I would say the best thing to do is to be flexible in this case, but make sure that we're maintaining our readiness. In the past, we've actually seen, including in the Obama administration, the use of some sort of strategic aircraft or even submarines, but these were often used as a way to send a message to North Korea. They're not necessary for these exercises. And so I certainly would be very cautious about returning to that kind of a structure, especially at this moment where we've kind of seen a dormancy in U.S.-North Korea discussions on denuclearization.
So if the two sides decide to give some kind of flexibility and resume these exercises, what should be the scale of this?
Again, I think it really matters as to, as Scott pointed out, what is the goal of these exercises? But at the end of the day, I think we need to take a very calculated approach to this and make sure that what we're doing is both necessary for readiness, but not having an unnecessarily negative impact on our potential diplomacy with North Korea, because frankly, the North Koreans are going to complain about almost any sort of U.S. ROK military exercise. And so the question is, how much are they going to complain, and what is their response to that?
All right, we'll leave it here for now and move on to our next segment. Let's now watch the video for our next topic.
All its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs until the DPRK takes concrete actions. We will continue to strictly enforce existing sanctions.
The European Union continues to take the lead in pressuring North Korea. It's calling on the regime to give up its nuclear weapons and plans to submit North Korea's human rights resolution to a UN Human Rights Council again. Sweden had hosted the U.S.-North Korea working level talks, facilitating the negotiations to take place. We take a look at the effects and the limits of the European Union's efforts in the denuclearization talks. So, Mr. Johnson, we're seeing the European Union continuing its calls to North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons program. So why are they taking the lead on the denuclearization efforts here?
Well, I'm not sure they're taking the lead per se, but they're doing what it is that they can do, which is to, first of all, enforce UN sanctions and also EU sanctions that have been put in place for many years. And the bigger picture here is that the European Union and European governments generally are very interested in upholding international institutions, right? And so there's a little bit of a concern, including through things like Brexit, the disintegration of the Iran nuclear deal, and the general return of bilateral politics, that these international institutions need to be reinforced. And so by working in a multilateral way, I think the EU and its member states are trying to show that they can play a role in helping to bring about denuclearization.
Do you think their efforts have been effective?
Well, what they've done is to really fill the vacuum left by absence of leadership by some other countries, including the U.S., for instance, in terms of pointing out that North Korea has been violating UN Security Council resolutions or stepping back from raising the flag of human rights in international forums. And so that is, I think, positive. But it also does run up against limits.
So if we take a look at one of the effects, Sweden has actually hosted the U.S. working level talks in October. So what do you think the European unions can do in order to contribute to facilitating these talks?
As you suggest, they did exactly that in Sweden, facilitate contact. But maybe the most important contribution of the European Union on this issue is to show the North Koreans that there are international standards. Because on a lot of these issues, including non-proliferation and human rights, the North Koreans like to fall into politicizing the relationship in the context of the U.S.-North Korea relationship, and to say that the U.S. has a hostile policy against North Korea. But it's a little bit harder if the North Koreans have to recognize or say that the world has a hostile policy toward North Korea, when in fact, actually, these European countries are standing up and saying, no, there are international standards that should have to be met, and North Korea is not meeting them.
How about the embassies that we have in North Korea? There are 7 European nations that have embassies. What kind of an effort can they do in order to make this diplomatic effort continue?
I think they're important because they provide some eyes and ears on the ground. I mean, one of the really dramatic, I think, or noticeable gaps that exist in U.S. policy understanding of North Korea over the course of the past 10 or 15 years is that we simply have fewer people who have had direct experience in North Korea. And I worry that actually that failure of understanding on the ground can have a negative impact on our ability to make policy. And so in a way, the European embassies provide a proxy view, because they do come through and brief and give us some sense of what is happening on the ground.
And Mr. Johnson, your expertise is in non-proliferation and you worked with the JCPOA. So what kind of efforts can the European nations do in terms of the non-proliferation front then?
I think they can play an incredibly important role. And one of these is in a concept that we call the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, or CTR. We at the Nuclear Threat Initiative authored a report last year that suggested that one of the ways to move forward on denuclearization, rather than try to do this to North Korea, is to do it with North Korea, which means that North Korea itself would be the ones that take apart equipment, take apart certain facilities, but they're going to need assistance. They're going to need training. They're going to need financing. And this is where not only countries like the United States and South Korea can play a role, but also European countries. We have to remember, for example, the North Korean main nuclear reactor at Yongbyon is actually of a British design. So the UK could be very helpful, even though they're not in the EU anymore, in to help take apart the Yongbyon reactor. The French have an incredibly important role to play on nuclear energy, and as a P5 nuclear weapon state, they could be very helpful in doing verification. And also European countries can help to provide funding to the IAEA for verifications.
And I also want to take a look at the human rights issues as well. The European nations are planning to submit a human rights resolution again this year. This is something that the US and Japan have relatively been refraining from doing. So what does it mean for the EU to be shedding light on this issue?
Well, again, North Korea has not been meeting international human rights standards. And it's important, I think, for the UN to play a role in shining a light on that. And so the European nations are taking up that cause and pointing to this area where North Korea needs to raise its game. And sometimes the Europeans are able to do it in a way that is just less political. And so, for instance, even the Universal Periodic Review, there are issues related to human rights that North Korea might be willing to, accept, at least in form, that are a step forward, even though it doesn't get to the worst piece of this. Or, for instance, I understand that at one time the UK was actually bringing North Koreans who visited to British prisons to see what a British prison system is like. And that has got to be an eye-opening experience for a North Korean diplomat.
But North Korea clearly doesn't want to deal with any other countries besides the US when it comes to nuclear issues. So what do you think are the limits of the European Union trying to engage with North Korea, facilitate talks between the US and North Korea?
I don't think that the European Union should have any illusions that they're going to be taking the lead on denuclearization. And I actually don't think that that's what they're doing. I think they're trying to be helpful. I think they're trying to reinforce norms, reinforce the implementation of sanctions to prevent further proliferation, and sort of be in a bit of a standby mode so that if there's a breakthrough between the United States and North Korea, hopefully supplemented by agreement and support from the countries of the region, basically those countries that participated in the six-party talks, I think the EU will be prepared to step in and play a supportive role, perhaps again through this concept of providing funds for cooperative threat reduction, funding for the IAEA. But at the end of the day, the Europeans are going to be standing a little bit off to the side, kind of cheering on what's going on, but they're not going to be taking the lead.
All right, we'll leave it here for now and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea photo of the week. Today we have a picture of the launch of a preparatory committee to establish the first ever political party composed of North Korean defectors in South Korea. This comes less than 2 months before the April 15th parliamentary elections, and defectors say they'll work for the democratization of North Korea and protecting defectors' human rights. Mr. Johnson, what do you make of this?
It's quite remarkable, actually, to see this happen. And it's another sign that South Korea is an extremely robust democracy. To see North Koreans being able to participate in South Korea as full citizens is a very positive sign. However, and actually the one thing I say with some hope in this is that we always continue to hear concerns that North Korean citizens that have moved to South Korea have some discrimination against them, despite all of the training that they get and all of the support. So I hope in one way the creation of this party will help to again put a spotlight on those people and try to reduce that level of discrimination within the South Korean society.
This is the most interesting step toward Korean unification that we've seen in a while, precisely because what we're talking about is the voicing of North Korean constituency concerns in a South Korean context. And so this provides a very interesting model and signal to other North Koreans that there is a space for North Korea to participate politically in South Korean society. And it has not always been clear that that space exists. So I think this is a really notable development.
I agree. We'll definitely have to keep an eye on their future movements going forward. Well, thank you for coming in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That does it for today's Washington Talk. And from all of us here at Voice of America, thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.